Hi, everyone. Welcome to our online event titled The Effects of the IHRA Definition of Antisemitism on Academic Freedom. My name is Paola Rivetti. I'm a member of the BRISMES Council, and also I'm the current chairperson of the Pedagogy and Outreach Committee. So it's my pleasure to welcome you all to our event. So as you probably know, today we are launching a report jointly researched and written by BRISMES and the European Legal Support Center. And the report is titled Freedom of Speech and Academic Freedom in UK Higher Education, the Adverse Impact of the IHRA Definition of Anti-Semitism. So in 2016, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance adopted a working definition of anti-Semitism, to which was appended a list of illustrative examples. Several of these examples conflates criticism of Israel and its policies, practices, and political ideology with anti-Semitism. It follows that a number of positions, such as supporting the right of self-determination of Palestinians, can be seen as a manifestation of anti-Semitism. There is a widespread agreement amongst scholars and legal experts that the IHRA definition is not appropriate for university setting, where critical thought and free debate are paramount. However, since 2020, more than 75% of UK universities have adopted some version of the definition as a basis for campus policies. With what consequences? We talk about this with our four speakers, Gabriel Frankel, Jamal, Hagit, and Akram Salhab. First, I would like to invite Gabriel Frankel, who is the European Legal Support Center legal officer in the UK. Please, Gabriel, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Paola. In 1999, in the case of Redmond Bate and the Director of Public Prosecution, Lord Justice Stephen Sedley, as he then was, held that free speech includes not only the inoffensive, but the irritating, the contentious, the eccentric, the heretical, the unwelcome, and the provocative, provided it does not tend to provoke violence. Freedom only to speak inoffensively, he said, is not worth having. He went on to say that, from the condemnation of Socrates to the persecution of modern writers and journalists, our world has seen too many examples of state control of unofficial ideas. A central purpose of the European Convention on Human Rights has been to set close limits to any such assumed power. 22 years later, in January 2021, the same Sir Stephen Sedley signed a letter in The Guardian alongside Sir Anthony Hopper, another former Lord Justice, Lord Hendy KC, Michael Mansfield KC, Professor Bill Bowring, Hugh Tomlinson KC, Francis Weber, and Sir Geoffrey Bindman KC, that said of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, or IHRA, definition of anti-Semitism, quote, "The legally entrenched right to free expression is being undermined by an internally incoherent, non-legally binding working definition of anti-Semitism. Its promotion by public bodies is leading to the curtailment of debate." The BRISMES ELSC IHRA report published this month is the first case-based report that evidences the concerns raised by Sir Stephen Sedley and many others about the use of the IHRA definition specifically in UK higher education. The report is based on 40 cases brought to the attention of the ELSC by UK university staff and students between January 2017 and May 2022, where accusations of anti-Semitism were leveled and disciplinary procedures invoked using the IHRA. In all but 2 of the cases, the accusations were rejected. In the final 2 ongoing cases, the accusations have yet to be substantiated. The 40 cases concern 24 university staff members, 9 students, and 7 student groups. The 40 cases occurred across 14 universities, 11 of which are part of the Russell Group. The report has 4 major findings. Firstly, the IHRA is having an adverse effect on freedom of speech and academic freedom. Second, it shows that targets of false accusations of anti-Semitism on the basis of the IHRA tend to be advocates of Palestinian human rights, critics of the Israeli state and its policies, and those researching and teaching about the history of and current situation in Israel-Palestine. Indeed, the investigations and disciplinary procedures often have had a significant impact on their mental health and physical well-being and their reputations, even though the accusations have been rejected or not yet substantiated. Third, the report shows that staff and students are being subjected to unreasonable investigations and disciplinary procedures on the basis of the IHRA, notwithstanding the caveats provided by some institutions as to their respect for freedom of speech and or the non-legally binding nature of the IHRA. Indeed, based on the cases, it is clear that university administrators often do not possess the necessary tools or background to independently assess the merits of such allegations and have little to no understanding of the Israel-Palestine question. Fourth and finally, the report shows that the IHRA is creating a chilling effect in UK higher education, deterring individuals from speaking about Palestinian human rights, Palestinian self-determination out of fear of being subject to complaints and or threats of legal action. This appears particularly and perhaps unsurprisingly true for staff on precarious contracts. While self-censorship is difficult to measure, testimonies collected show that the adoption of the IHRA in universities is causing people to avoid discussing issues related to Palestine, and it is instilling fear. For example, one Palestine student society lost almost the entirety of its membership, reducing in size from 30 to 2 members, because, as a member testified, everyone was scared after an incident whereby the IHRA was used to target an event. The IHRA definition of anti-Semitism must be understood in a wider context of attacks on advocates for Palestinian rights. It is not the first tool of its kind, and it is likely it won't be the last. And it is, of course, important to note that it has been invoked and had similar impacts well beyond the UK in higher education, as explained in previous reports published by the ELSC concerning the wider European context, which adds to a growing body of evidence already produced in the USA and Canada that demonstrates similar harmful consequences for the rights of advocates for Palestine. This report also demonstrates that it is possible to push back against these attacks. For example, in 2021, 15 academics were subjected to disciplinary investigations by their university in the span of only 7 months. Anonymous complaints against them had been submitted, alleging that they had participated in anti-Semitic activity or shared anti-Semitic content online or in their academic literature. The complaints used spurious evidence, including simple letters of support for fellow Palestinian human rights defenders and liked or bookmarked social media content. However, after lengthy disciplinary proceedings and with the support of the ELSC, the university cleared all 15 academics of these allegations. You can see more about our challenges to the IHRA definition and ELSC's work in the UK at elsc.support/our work in the UK. Nevertheless, the burden to protect fundamental rights of staff, students, or other activists should not be subjected, nevertheless, staff, students, and other activists should not be subjected to these accusations and these lengthy investigations and disciplinary procedures. Universities have legal obligations to uphold academic freedom and freedom of expression and have a duty of care to their staff and students. This is why, with this report, we are calling on higher education institutions to rescind their adoption of the IHRA definition immediately and halt any use of its use in disciplinary proceedings and investigations. The ELSC has many cases in the UK. We are monitoring and collecting data on incidents and reports of repression, and we're providing active legal support to those impacted. And there are many ways you can support and get involved in our work. So please visit elsc.support. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Gabriel. I would like now to invite Ben Jamal, who has been the director of the Palestinian Solidarity Campaign and currently is a member of the British Palestinian Committee, to ask him to describe for us the wider context the report addresses. As we heard from Gabriel, there is a larger context that we have to kind of see in order to understand the larger picture. Ben, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Paola, and thank you to BRISMES for hosting this important event. It is an important event because it is drawing attention to an important report, and it is crucial that attention is given to it. I should begin by saying there was nothing in this report that was a surprise to us at PSC. For a number of years, we have worked very closely with ELSC in addressing the types of cases which the report draws attention to: academics and students facing investigational disciplinary procedures, or events on campuses facing cancellation because of spurious allegations of anti-Semitism that all have in common that they can be shown to arise from a conflation of anti-Semitism with legitimate advocacy for Palestinian rights. So what I want to do, as Paola said, in the time available, is to focus on how we need to understand, picking up on what Gabriel said, how we need to understand what is documented in this report as part of a wider process that is happening globally and is not solely an issue confined to academic environments. And this global context is Israel's campaign to delegitimize the Palestinian struggle for liberation, to silence Palestinian voices, to prevent Palestinians bringing the facts of their history, of our history, and of their oppression into the public domain, and to call for and receive solidarity with the legitimate struggle for rights and freedom. So I'm going to focus on how this is playing out in wider spaces in the UK beyond academia, but it is worth, first of all, grounding what I say in the reality that this act of silencing and repression is, of course, enacted in the first place and most heavily on Palestinians within the territory of historic Palestine. And the ultimate objective of this process is to enable Israel to continue to enforce a system of apartheid on Palestinians without being subject to accountability, without facing the consequences that should follow for any state which is a serial violator of international law and human rights: isolation, diplomatically, politically, militarily, and economically. So successive Israeli governments have for many years sought to delegitimize activism for Palestinian rights, but this process has become intensive, organized, and systematic in the past 15 years or so, largely in response to the growing strength of the international solidarity movement and growing support in particular for the BDS movement after the call for boycott, divestment and sanctions was made by Palestinian civil society in 2005. Israel's overarching goal within this effort of delegitimization is to reframe solidarity with Palestinians as something hostile, as something toxic, and ultimately as something anti-Semitic, with the IHRA definition emerging in the past 8 to 10 years as the key tool in this process. The aim is to divide or separate Palestine solidarity from other progressive movements, to isolate it and confine it to the margins of political discourse. Now, one aspect of this campaign is conducted through what we call lawfare, and in particular, getting allied governments to introduce laws and regulations that in some way seek to prescribe support for BDS. In this way, we have seen more than 30 states in the United States introduce such laws, and similar laws and regulations being employed in Europe, including in Germany and France. And as Gabriel has indicated, pushing back against such attempts to introduce regulations and their consequences on those active for Palestinian rights is a fundamental part of the work that ELSC does. We have an attempt now, as many of you will be aware, to do the same in the UK. In June, the government tabled in Parliament the Economic Activities of Public Bodies Bill, better known as the Anti-Boycott Bill. It's a bill that seeks to stop public bodies, which of course include universities, making decisions not to invest in or procure from companies that can be shown to be complicit in Israel's violation of international law and Palestinian rights. And although that is the primary target, the bill has been drawn very broadly so that it actually forbids any divestment or procurement decision made on the basis of moral or political disapproval by a public body of the actions of a foreign state. So that would, for example, also outlaw decisions made to divest from a company complicit in supporting China's oppression of the Uyghur people. So here we see a confluence of agendas from a government which wishes to shield Israel from accountability, but also more broadly wants to clamp down on the right to protest and the right to hold public authorities and those in power to account. But the primary intention is made clear not just in the government rhetoric surrounding the bill, but in a special clause in the bill. The bill contains a provision to allow the government, by passing future regulations, to exempt certain states from falling under the rubric of the law. However, one state, Israel, is given a unique shield. No government minister can exempt it from the scope of the bill and allow divestment by a public body, no matter how egregious its violations of the rights of the Palestinian people. And the rationale and the justification for the bill and for that specific clause takes us back to the heart of the delegitimization narrative. And that is an argument used that when the Palestinian people call for BDS and when people support that call, then the motivation must be anti-Semitic. Why? Because Israel is the world's only Jewish state, and the BDS call only asks for action against Israel and not simultaneously for action against other right-abusing states. Now, outside of these efforts to introduce laws, we are seeing this delegitimization campaign manifested outside of academic spaces in efforts to target or close down events, including events that are a manifestation or celebration of Palestinian culture. You may be aware of two of the most egregious examples of these processes. In 2019, Tower Hamlets Council refused permission for a bicycle ride raising money for sick children in Gaza to finish in a council-run park because council officials feared that references on the organizers' website to the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians in 1948 and to Israel practicing the crime of apartheid might violate the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which the council had recently adopted. More recently, Chelsea and Westminster Hospital, following lobbying by a pernicious organization called UK Lawyers for Israel, removed an exhibition of pottery plates created by children in schools in Gaza. The argument that prompted that action was that the plates were offensive to the Jewish community because one, for example, showed a picture of Al-Aqsa Mosque with a Palestinian flag flying above it, which it was alleged disrespected the importance of that site to the Jewish people. And all of you will be familiar, and don't need me to repeat here, how this conflation of anti-Semitism and advocacy for Palestinian rights has been played out in the Labour Party following the election of Jeremy Corbyn as leader. So this is the wider context within which what is happening in academic spaces in the UK, as documented by the report, is occurring. At its heart is a project of erasure, erasing Palestinian voices, erasing the facts of their history, erasing the facts and the truths of their ongoing oppression, and even erasing the celebration of Palestinian culture and life. And alongside this is the desire and intent, as Gabriel said, to create a chilling effect, to give people a message that if you engage in solidarity with Palestine, if you seek to address the facts of Palestinian history, you will be met with accusations of anti-Semitism. So finally, it's important that we use this report in the right way. And I want to talk about this from a campaigning perspective. I know that Akram is going to talk through the responses we need to the evidence produced in this report. But let me just say a couple of things. The report makes clear that the IHRA definition is not fit for purpose, should not be adopted, and that if adopted by any institution, by any university, then that decision should be rescinded. And it will add weight to campaigns within universities making that argument and making that call. But the other effect and intent of this delegitimization campaign is to add to the chilling effect and the erasure of Palestinian voices by making those engaged in activism for Palestinian rights place their energy in defending their space and engaging in an argument about what is and is not anti-Semitic, rather than centering campaigns on Palestinian rights. So as we do what we need to do to defend the space, armed with reports like this and armed with legal responses, it is also crucial that we continue to act to enlarge the space. As they try to marginalize campaigns and confine them to the peripheries of political discourse, it is important that we continue to build broader and larger coalitions for justice. And we can see an example of that process in play in the opposition to the anti-boycott bill, where PSC has been able to pull together a coalition of more than 70 civil society groups who agree in recognizing the bill as an assault on the rights of Palestinians, but simultaneously an assault on wider democratic freedoms. That is our best response to this delegitimization campaign, to defend our space, including, as I say, through legal responses, but to refuse to be silenced, to continue to campaign, to continue to assert the facts about the nature of the oppression being visited upon the people of Palestine, and our responsibilities to address the UK's complicity in supporting that oppression.
Thank you so much, Ben. So talking about the context for this report, I would like now to invite Hagit Borer, who's a professor of linguistics at Queen Mary University of London, a fellow of the Linguistic Society of America and of the British Academy, to discuss the politics that comes with the adoption and implementation of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism and what interests it defends. Hagit, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Paola. I think that when I want to, in particular, take off from what we just heard from Ben, and that is the question of what it is exactly that the agenda that is behind adoption of the IHRA, not specifically by people, but by governments and organizations, and what is the agenda that is being protected here and why, and also equally, if not more importantly, what are exactly the facts which this particular definition and the particular way in which it's been weaponized is looking to suppress. And so to do that, we really need to look a little bit at what is happening in Israel/Palestine. And it is important for me to start off by saying that the aims of the Zionist movement from before the institution of the State of Israel in 1948 and certainly since have been extremely consistent. And that is that it has been the aim to come to control the entire area of what was the Western mandatory Palestine, and to institute in it to the best extent possible, an exclusive or near exclusive Jewish population. This is, I think it's very important to remember that this is the aim. There is no inherent aim in oppressing the indigenous population. The oppression of the indigenous population comes from the simple reason that they are superfluous in this particular vision of things. And this, I think, determines certain kinds of activities that have been going on, certainly in plain view for quite a few years. It's also worthwhile noting in the same context that what Israel is trying to hide, what the gag order is, quote unquote, that's coming to us from the IHRA restrictions is not difficult to find. They're just between 2020 and 2022, there have been four very detailed reports on the part of Human Rights Watch, on the part of Amnesty International, on the part of B'Tselem, which is the leading human rights organization in Israel, and on the part of the UN, which outlined the definition, which outlined the actual situation on the ground very, very clearly. The use of the terms ethnic cleansing or apartheid or various, one can even see genocide sometimes. These are terms that have been in various reports and various things that are available in the public domain. And I very much want to echo Ben's impression that the shrillness of the particular focus of the IHRA, the weaponization of anti-Semitism specifically that we've been seeing in the last 10 to 15 years is directly connected to the fact that the truth on the ground are becoming harder and harder to conceal. I want to share with you a few slides, and these will give you a bit of an idea of specifically what has been happening roughly since 1967, but what the situation is today. It should be it's important to stress that what's been happening since 1967 and the situation today is a continuation of what I believe we could see as a continuous effort that started in 1948 in the shape of expelling or making it impossible to return to 750,000 people and the systematic destruction of the villages and towns where they came from. And we've seen the same thing happening since 1967 relative to the remaining 22% of mandatory Palestine, which Israel had come to control. And so if you will just give me a second, I will share my screen. Okay, so all these slides are available on the B'Tselem website, and I very much encourage people to avail themselves of the resources there, which are very, very valuable. Are the slides visible? Is everything working okay? Okay, so what you see here, the specific map that you see here, this is the map of the green line. The green line is the armistice line that was put in place at the end of the 1948-1949 war. And this is the line that was effectively eliminated by the 1967 war. The areas in dark brown are areas that are built up Palestinian areas. This is from 2015, and chances are it's not much changed because it's impossible to obtain building permits. Jumping to 1993, which is the Oslo Accords, the West Bank specifically was divided into three areas. Area A, which you have here in blue, Area C, which you see here in blue, and which, as you can see, is the dominant, it's 60% of the area, is under exclusive Israeli control. What you see in dark and light brown are respectively 18% of the area, which is under the exclusive Palestinian Authority control, and the remaining 22%, which are joint Palestinian and Israeli control. And what is very important when looking at this map is to realize that when you look at the blue area, the area that is Area C and which is under Israeli control, that it is not only 60%, but as you can see, it cuts into the Palestinian area in ways which creates a whole collection of isolated cantons. What Israel has done prior to 1995 and subsequent to 1995 is filled that blue area primarily with actual blocks in the form of closed areas, blocks in the form of roads, and of course, blocks in terms of settlements. And you can see for instance, closed military zones, which are the gray, the nature reserves and national parks. These are all areas which Palestinians cannot access. These are areas that are by definition barred to Palestinians. and declared state land. This is all being done through a variety of legal means, which are very cynically put in order to exactly justify this particular land grab. Here you see the roads. The roads that are marked here are roads that Palestinians cannot access. So these are Jewish-only roads. You can also see what the checkpoints look like. Okay, and you can see that what the emerging picture is that the Palestinian control over their own space is completely decimated and is basically non-existent. It can take hours to get from one village to an adjacent village because the roads are not there, because there are roadblocks and so on and so forth. Okay. Here you also have the settlements, and so you can see that the areas that are part of the 60%, which are controlled by Israel, are being filled by Jewish settlers. And these Jewish settlers live under very different conditions from their Palestinian neighbors. They have a different legal system, they have different roads, they are part of Israel, even if not legally in terms of where they reside, in terms of the laws that actually apply to them and so on. This is quite apart from what is happening in Gaza. Gaza has, as we all know, has been under siege since 2007. The economy of Gaza has been completely and totally destroyed, and there isn't even any clean water there, and fishing areas have been restricted. I will turn off the sharing now. Okay, so this is really, I think, in a nutshell, that's the Zionist project. The Zionist project is to come to control the area and to make everything possible to encourage the local population by all means necessary to depart or to acquiesce, but best to depart. It's important to perhaps highlight the way in which this is different from, let's say, South Africa, because the particular setup as it now exists, if you look at it just true as of today, the 28th of September 2023, and the description of apartheid is extremely factually accurate, because you have two different legal systems, you have two different economies, you have two different set of restrictions, you have restrictions on movement that apply only on one part of the population, you have restrictions on residence that apply on one part of the population, and so on and so forth. You have one part of the population that cannot vote, and so on. And but it is important to understand that the situation as it now stands from the perspective of the Zionist project is temporary. The situation is dynamic and it has a purpose, and the purpose is not to institute an existing apartheid. It is true about South Africa, the white regime in South Africa, as it is true about Zionism, that was a search to control resources. But in South Africa, those resources included actually the labor of the local population. But in Israel-Palestine, that is a temporary, that is not the end goal. The end goal is to actually do as much as possible to drive the population out. The attempts to drive the local population out include economic restrictions that have basically prevented the emergence of any independent economy or industry. They include restrictions on agriculture. In the Gaza Strip, they also include restrictions on fishing. They include severe restrictions on access to water, restrictions on commerce, restrictions on free movement, limitations on residence rights, limitations on access to medical care, limitations on access to education, and complete impossibility of expanding in terms of an absolute prohibition on building permits and the construction of infrastructure. and so on and so forth. Okay, for Gaza, this has taken the shape, as I already mentioned, of a siege that has now lasted 17 years, which resulted in the 80% of the population of Gaza being dependent on external aid in order to survive, because there's absolutely no other way to survive there. And this is all alongside what has become routinized violence. And this routinized violence takes two main avenues. One is routinized violence on the part of the army. I'm not talking about, for instance, the incursion into the Jenin refugee camp that happened in this last spring. And I'm not even talking about the once every 3 years attacks on Gaza. I'm talking about routinized every night, every day, for instance, invasions of raidings of residences in the middle of the night in a completely arbitrary fashion, raising the whole family, terrorizing everybody, which is something that is happening on a regular basis and planned. And there's routinized violence that comes on the part of settlers, and that is there are outposts of settlers throughout the West Bank of people who regularly attack their Palestinian neighbors. They vandalize them, they burn their trees, they destroy their cars, they stone them, sometimes they even shoot them. The army is almost always there as a passive participant, and the army only interferes when the Palestinians actually choose to react. Okay. So this is all the reality of the people who are on the ground, and this is the reality which Israel is seeking not to expose. Okay. There is a very separate question which I don't believe I could possibly respond to in the time given, and that is, why is it that if you take, for instance, the UK government and the legislation that Ben had just mentioned, why is it that the UK or the United States or Germany, various other countries opt to participate in suppressing the resistance to what is going on? And given the fact that the facts are known, the facts have been known, the facts are there for everybody to access them if they so choose, given the fact that this has been going on not since yesterday, and given the fact that the present Israeli government, as well as some of its presidents, have made it entirely clear and explicit that this is in fact their agenda. And yet we still have much effort on the part of major Western powers to suppress this reality. And I think this must be understood in a much broader context, which I couldn't possibly begin to address, and has to do with the general global picture of the world today and the particular role that the state of Israel has come to play in that major overall picture. And I may be able to say things if people ask questions, but at this point I will just stop. Okay.
Thanks very much, Hagit. So we are moving now to our last but not least speaker, Akram, who's a PhD student in politics, at Queen Mary University of London, and the long-standing organizer for democratic rights in Palestine and UK universities. So I would like to invite him to discuss the report recommendation, but also his work on Palestinian students' experiences of study in the UK. Akram, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone, and thanks to ELSC, BRISMES, and everyone who pulled together this very important, I don't want to say great report, but very important report, because it documents many of the things that we as students have been experiencing for many, many years. And prior to the IHRA, but something that's been strengthened by the expansion and the use of the IHRA. In my intervention, I'm going to cover the recommendations of the report, but I also want to talk about the context in which kind of hone in a little bit on specifically what we mean by silencing and what the specific objectives of the use of the IHRA are, and then some suggestions about how we can counter that as academics, as people involved in higher education institutions. Because really, if you look through the report and you look at the recommendations, there's a very clear message to student unions, to universities, to anyone responsible for policy in higher education, that we have to repeal the IHRA. And whilst I agree with that as an objective, I also think that's the start / the culmination of a whole range of activities which we need to think of and implement in organizing spaces, in policy spaces, in institutions that can make it possible not just to speak about Palestine on the margins, but to have Palestine right at the center of discussion on campus, of campaigns, of academic research, of all areas of university life. So with that in mind, I think that in reviewing what the objectives are of the IHRA and its precursor, which used to be called the EUMC definition of anti-Semitism, which was verbatim the same definition that was used, we're really looking at two things. So not just silencing about Palestine, but limiting who can speak about Palestine, and secondly, what they can say about Palestine. So the objective is not necessarily total silence, but a very restricted way in which you can speak about Palestine, and that audience and those speaking about Palestine being very limited in number. So in what I mean by limiting what you can say about Palestine, there was a report in 2005 by the Reut Institute who discussed what they should be doing is distinguishing between hard critics of Israel and soft critics of Israel. The hard critics being people who oppose the structure of Israeli settler colonialism and apartheid, and the soft critics being people who think that this policy of the Netanyahu government or some of the policies in occupied West Bank are objectionable. And the idea that the Reut Institute was pushing was that if we distinguish between these two groups, then we can establish the idea that Israel is a normal state just like any other. We can accept these soft criticisms, and we can delegitimize the ability to talk about structural oppression that Palestinians face. So, and the specific target of that is the BDS campaign, and people who support BDS. And by doing so, by making this distinction, one of the objectives was to cast those people who they categorized as hard critics as extreme, controversial, and beyond the speech of what was beyond acceptable and outside the bounds of acceptable speech. So that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to force Palestine to the margins and to be accepted as a form of extremist speech. And I think Ben was very clear on this. What we're talking about is the right of Palestinians to speak about their facts of their history, very concrete material, mainstream documented facts, not the opinions, not our extremist opinions being acceptable within liberal society, because that's not what Palestine is. And the way that they've attempted to delimit who can speak about Palestine is by making it a question of self-definition. So they say that the IHRA is a definition that has been endorsed by the IHRA and by many Jewish community organizations. They agree with it as a definition, therefore we must accept it as such. So, and one of the tools that they were doing this in the British context, and I think the context of anti-racist work in Britain is important for considering this, is the idea of self-definition that comes from the McPherson report. And they've slightly cynically misused that to say that we can define terms which trample on other people's rights and silence what people can say, and tried to use tried to push that to say that only Jewish people can speak about what's happening in Palestine, and that their self-definition of what they find offensive is enough to trump what is established historical fact. So by restricting them who can speak about Palestine, as well as what they can say. So I think that given that the objective is to limit who can speak about Palestine and what they can say, our objective with people at higher education institutions is to expand the number of people who can speak about Palestine and make it possible for them to speak about it in terms that ensure that we stay within the mainstream of the university and resist this attempt to put us to the margins and push us, categorized as extremist, controversial, and all of this language that we hear over and over again. So yeah, one of the ways in which I think that we need to be careful about how we describe some of the campaigns that we organize is the language of free speech and the language of acceptable speech. So in legal terms, it's very often useful to say this is an issue of free speech and we can define it in those terms. But one needs to be careful because that plays into this attempt to force us into the category by saying, yes, you may say what you wish to say about Palestine, but this is controversial and extremist and therefore must be treated as such, either by having a neutral chair your event, or by having to balance the speaker, or by having special conditions placed on you when you're organizing around Palestine. And this is something that happens quite frequently, whereby Palestinians say we have the right to speak about this, and they say yes, but it's a controversial topic, it's potentially extremist, and this is where the prevent legislation also is used in order to force special conditions and thereby limit what people can say on Palestine. So we need to use the question to free speech strategically, and sometimes not use it by saying that we are talking about established historical fact, we are talking about certain rights and the Human Rights Act that allow us to talk about those historical facts and experiences, and they are not controversial and that they are not extremist. And the second thing is to expand the number of people who feel that they can talk about this. So I think that, you know, one of the things I've faced recently, for example, is people often saying, well, you're Palestinian, you must speak about Palestine. And I think that sometimes it's useful for me to speak about Palestine as a Palestinian, but also we want to make sure that everyone can speak about Palestine. And so we need to make we need to, first of all, ensure that people feel comfortable doing that. We need to make events, and let's call them safe spaces, where they're on panels, where they're supported. If there are big name academics who want to work on Palestine, we give them time and energy into supporting them, to knowing what kind of language to use, when to deploy it, how to work in the different academic arenas, universities that they're operating in. So I think that this is something really important, that we want to make it possible by taking actions within our universities that make Palestine easier to contend with. We can make it such that people are not running away from it because it's controversial, but coming towards it because, you know, I mean, I can give some examples if I'm sounding a bit vague. You know, we'd always get out, in university, we'd always rent the biggest academic hall. We'd always get an academic speaker to chair the event. We'd carefully discuss the title. We'd work everything through. So we'd create a space where the person who'd never worked on Palestine before would feel that they were comfortable doing that. Not that they were going to come and be shouted down, or there's going to be some controversy in the media. We'd speak to them beforehand, doing the footwork and preparing to make sure everything that's done around Palestine is a win, is a very important thing to bear in mind, because not everyone, such as I imagine many people on this call will be, have the experience and the history of working on that. So making sure Palestine is accessible, but also embedding it within much broader movements, anti-racist movements on campuses, other social movements, where the general call that Palestine has, the demand for freedom that it encapsulates, ties into those similar struggles, which can strengthen both in the process. So I have 3 suggestions specifically about how we can do that. One is by focusing really on, as Hagit did today, on the reality of what's happening in Palestine. What are the facts of what's happening to Palestinians? How can we make that very clear and very personable? The idea of the IHRA and other tactics is to try and cover up what's happening in Palestine. How can we make sure that very clear? What Palestinians can we get to speak? How can we humanize and make that understandable and comprehensible? As well as a systemic analysis and discussion of apartheid, how can we humanize that and make that tangible? There's a very strong campaign at BRISMES University called the Right to Education campaign. There's lots of academics and students that are involved with that. How can we work, for instance, with such campaigns to make sure that the issue of education, at least, is something that we can bring over a delegation, and they can talk about that alongside, as I say, the harder edge campaigns that can build on that to take action, for instance, on BDS or to place pressure on our institutions. And I think this, I'm kind of reiterating myself, the question of building coalitions is crucially important to make sure that Palestine, it's not possible to marginalize Palestine in the way that it's being attempted to be marginalized. And, you know, every student can tell you there's repeated attempts to try and get all progressive movements in a university on one side and Palestine on the other. So making sure it stays embedded within these coalitions, and that's a whole piece of kind of organizing work. And also, I think it's very important that the best way to think that the best way that we can counter the attempt to silence Palestine is bringing Palestine in the center of everything in our university. In our syllabus, we have syllabi, is Palestine in there? In what context? Not just on counter-terror or terrorism courses, I hope, not just on Middle East history courses, but on political thought, anthropology, whatever it is. There's many ways, even if you're a scientist, there's a brilliant initiative called Scientists for Palestine who do incredible work organizing with Palestinian institutions. So, you know, there are lots of creative ways to work on Palestine, which is the strongest way to counter the attempt to silence. So I think I'm happy to talk about some more of these initiatives and what they mean, but I really think that when we think about struggling about the IHRA, we're really talking about much broadly about Palestine in the academy. And the focus on the IHRA is one part of a much wider set of steps we need to take. And it's great that you've all joined this call because it means you're ready to take them. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Akram, and thanks to our four wonderful speakers and you know, who shared with us very important insights. So I'd like to open the floor for